What's up, guys? Josh here from Doyen Artists. I kind of wanted to try to mimic a little bit of what Chase is doing with his acting tip of the day, and kind of approach it from like a DP, director of photography standpoint, and maybe do like a photo tip of the day. Now, granted, Chase has been acting for quite some time now, so he's got a lot of experience in the industry. So I'm just going to be covering things that I feel like I've got a good understanding of. For now, while I kind of acquire those skills and gain that knowledge within the photography realm. So these aren't going to be like pro tips, expert tips. These are just going to be things that I've learned along the way, and I'm going to try to update you guys like weekly. Like, hey, I learned this today, or hey, I learned this a few weeks ago in this last shoot. So that's what this is today. So today, I really wanted to cover aperture. Maybe you've heard the term before, but all aperture is the amount of light that the lens is letting through. Aperture can be used for a number of reasons, including what I just mentioned, letting more light or less light through at one point in time, but can also be used for different creative purposes, such as how much bokeh you can get, which is kind of like that blurred out background, just like maybe you can see right here. Okay, so the first thing I want to cover is depth of field. All depth of field is basically how much of your subject is in focus. So when we're talking about that in terms of aperture, we're saying that a wider aperture with a smaller number, say f1.8, is going to create a shallower depth of field, meaning less of your subject is going to be in focus. And then the opposite is also true, that a more narrow aperture is going to create a broader depth of field. You're going to have more of your subject in focus, and that f-stop number is also going to be higher. So f, 4, 5, 6, it'll keep going up. So depth of field kind of leads right into bokeh, and bokeh, I believe, is Japanese for blurry. You can correct me if I'm wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure that's the definition. I'll throw the definition up here just in case. When you have a very shallow depth of field, in other words, you have a very small aperture number and a very wide open aperture, you're going to get more bokeh in your shot. So when you think of bokeh, think of those like creamy backgrounds with like maybe lights in the background that have like this glow to them, but you can't make out the light. All you can see is this blurriness that is around the light, that surrounds the light. One good way that I like to think of it is when I take my glasses off. Right now I'm wearing contacts, but when I take those out, basically what I see is blurry, right? And if you see lights, all you'll see is like a bright ring where the light would be. So having a more shallow depth of field is going to create a more intense bokeh effect, which is cool for cinematic purposes. It's also really usually aesthetically pleasing for interview style shots. Bokeh and depth of field definitely go hand in hand. The opposite is true when you have that higher aperture number. Say you're stopped up to f8, right? Or even f10. You're going to have more of that background in focus, and that bokeh effect is not going to be as noticeable. I'm going to cover the aperture number and what that aperture number means and how it affects your depth of field as well as the bokeh that's kind of happening out in the background. So right now I'm set at an aperture of f2.8, which isn't super shallow. It's not super wide open, but it's also not super closed off. It's like, I find it to be a good aperture for filming a lot of the cinematic films. In fact, with our short films, a lot of times you'll find me filming at around f2.8 to f4. It's usually what I sit at. Sometimes it'll be a little higher than that. But regardless, I'm going to show you kind of how the light changes when you adjust this number. So right now f2.8, and we bump it down to f1.8. And you can see that it got a whole lot brighter in here. In fact, I am about 2.5 stops overexposed right now. So by opening that up, I get a lot more light, as well as maybe you noticed, but the background just got significantly blurrier. If I get a little closer, you can really tell how blurry that is. And you can see actually, the focus might be actually on my eyes right now, but it fades off pretty quickly, probably around my temples here, and then becomes really shallow. So that's kind of how that aperture number, so lowering your aperture, the lower your aperture number, the wider open the ring is, it's letting in more light, and it's also creating a shallower depth of field. So we're going to do the opposite, and we're going to bump it to probably like let's do f10. Now, if you notice, we're letting in significantly less light. F10 is a pretty closed off aperture. To compensate for this, I probably should bump up the ISO so you can see, and you can see that there's a lot more in focus here. You can see that I can still get a slightly blurry background, but overall you can pretty much make out everything going on behind me. So the higher the aperture number, the more narrow the aperture ring is, which means it's letting in less light, but it also controls your depth of field, and it's letting in more depth of field. So there's going to be more in focus. You can see that fall off is not going to be nearly as evident. So the focus is on my eyes, and then the fall off starts probably a little bit behind my head here, and then kind of just tapers off after that. So that's how those aperture numbers control things like depth of field and bokeh. So now I'm back at f2.8, ISO 400, and I'm just below one stop overexposed, which I find to be the best setting for these Canon cameras that we film with typically. So when you're shooting at a larger aperture number and you want to shoot, say, a landscape, you put it maybe at f16 or something like that, you're going to have pretty much all of your shot in focus. You're going to see everything. It's going to be very crisp, very clean. And then the opposite is true. You set it down to f 1.4 or 1.8, and you're going to create this like very visually appealing, what's the word, like portrait style image, where there's runoff on the face, and where the runoff on the face just kind of the background just kind of melts away once it gets past the cheeks. Even the ears might be out of focus at that point. So the reason I wanted to talk about aperture as like the first DP tips thing was because I personally think aperture is one of the most important, if not the most important, creative choice you can make when either taking photos or shooting film. For example, being able to know exactly the aperture you're going to need in order to get that blurry background or those beautiful bokeh effects on the lights behind you, as well as knowing which setting you're going to have to put it on to achieve the effect of having everything in focus. As a general good rule of thumb, when you're shooting landscapes, you typically want a larger aperture number. So although you're letting less light in, you can compensate for that with either shutter speed or ISO or ND filters. So I hope that's a good generalization of kind of what aperture is. Maybe not so much how to use it or when to use it, but the effects that you can get out of it. How and when to use those different ones is entirely going to be up to you creatively. You can still create amazing looking cinematic shots even at these larger aperture numbers. And then the opposite is true. You of course have lots of creative choices that you can use with these low aperture numbers, f1.4, 1.8, 2. It's entirely up to you. But what I would do, the first thing I would do is always make sure that your camera is set to manual. In most situations, manual is by far going to be your best option. So by setting manual, you have the limitless control and limitless options of your creative choices. So being able to change the aperture, set your camera to manual, you can adjust it up and down and kind of see the different effects. I highly encourage, this is what I did when I first got my camera, and I think this was my first lens, is this old 50 millimeter f1.8, I believe. And it's an old lens. I think it's from the 80s. It's loud, the motor's crazy, but it had that really wide open aperture, and I really kind of wanted to experience what that was. When when I was first getting into photography, I did not understand what that was. So once I ordered this lens, it was pretty cheap. I think I got it on eBay for like 80 bucks or something like that, 90 bucks. The first thing I did was throw my camera into manual mode and start changing the aperture to see the different effects I got. And I'll try to find some old images that I have and throw them up here with this lens when I first got it, and you can kind of get an idea of like, oh wow, like that's how we used aperture to get this shallow depth of field. And then I'll also find I'll see if I can find some images that I've taken, some landscapes where I've used this really narrow aperture to try to get everything in focus. General rule of thumb is I'm not always a fan of rules, even though rules are good, but they're always meant to be broken a little bit. So find what works for you. Find a fast lens, fast prime lens, or even a fast zoom lens. Put it on your camera, put it in manual mode, and just have fun. Just play with the settings. See what kind of effects you can achieve. It's so worth it, especially if you're going to, be into photography or cinematography over long term, or you want to make a career out of it. Aside from that, Doyen has a new logo we set up, which is pretty cool. And we have a lot of things planned for this summer. Despite COVID, we still have a couple of shoots lined up where hopefully everything goes smooth. In 2 weeks, we're shooting two movies in Los Angeles. In August, we also have some potential things lined up. And there's also talks about having a potential film competition. So, you can keep an eye on our site for any updates on that. But right now it's still very much in the works. But we'll keep you updated on that. But aside from that, have fun, play with your camera. Yeah.